Pisano Stratton, and I am a junior here at Springfield College and the co-president of the YMCA Club. As an API student here on campus, I believe it is important and crucial to no longer be silent and take a stance against racism. And that begins here by having this conversation. I'm proud to work with the Office of Inclusion and Community Engagement, as well as the Office of YMCA Relations to make this day possible. I hope to bring the voices of the students of Asian American, and Pacific Islander descent to the forefront as we deal with the rise of hate crimes in the United States. In order to be inclusive of all communities attending tonight and be mindful of those who have been impacted by recent hate crimes, we will be using the phrase Asian Pacific Islander, or API, when we refer to this community. We are going to begin tonight's program with our keynote speaker, Trang Chonghyo. But before I introduce her, we do ask that all questions be held until the end of the program. And due to one of our guest speakers being a service member, we do ask that all political related questions please be withheld. Well then, please help me introduce Trang Chonghyo. She is joining us from YUSA, and she joined YUSA in 2013 and is now the Director of Newcomer Engagement and Global Strategies. Trang leads and coordinates efforts to strengthen the capacity of local YUSA to work with newcomer immigrant communities and successfully impact diverse communities. The floor is yours, Trang.
Thank you. Thanks, Allie. Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to join you all for this conversation that's much needed. As Allie is pulling up my presentation, I think earlier on you saw the slides with sort of what was going on, right? Like the questions of where are you from? Where's your family from? What are you? And being a Asian American, I get these questions a lot. And, I think it's because people want to truly get to know you, right? They want to, they ask you questions like, what brings you here? Where are you from? But I also get the question like, what are you? And in my mind, I'm like, what do you mean, what am I? I'm human, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm a life partner. So when I get that question a lot, I know that the person is trying to, ask around my cultural heritage. And then when I get that question, where are you from? My response is always like, well, I'm from Long Beach, California. Or I say my husband's family is from Chicago. But then I know, again, they're hinting towards my race and ethnicity. So the question comes out, okay, where's your family from? And I go, oh, they're from Cambodia and Vietnam. So, I'm gonna share my identity. I self-identify as Cambodian, Vietnamese, and Chinese. My race is Asian, and I identify as Asian American. Moving on, some quick background, like Allie mentioned, I work for YMCA of the USA. And if you can go to the next slide, Allie, my parents were refugees coming from Southeast Asia, and they fled the war that was happening there. And my family settled in Long Beach, California, and really found the why when I was doing my undergrad in college, and just completely found a career within the YMCA working with the most vulnerable communities and really helping to provide voice to communities who do not have voices. So I was really committed to really helping the YMCA serve all communities, and this is where I am today. And I'm excited to kind of share a little bit more about that journey, but also being someone that identifies as Asian Pacific Islander, really wanting to kind of share a little bit of history and context of sort of understanding the Asian Pacific Islander identity. So going on to the next slide. So as you can see, there are over 50 distinct countries in the continent of Asia. The assumption that all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are all the same creates this what we call a monodimension Asian American and Pacific Islander, or AAPI, without regard to intersection. It does not take account into class, citizenship, language, gender, sexuality, ability, religion, and other social identities. Other groups in the Asian Pacific Islander diaspora are race, and their lived realities are diminished, right? So we have to really understand the diversity within this community. Like Ali mentioned, Asian Pacific Islander, not just one community, not just one ethnic group, but it's very diverse, as you can see from this map. Moving on to the next slide, as you can see, the Asian American identity ethnic groups in the US spans from Filipino, Indian, Vietnamese, Korean, Japanese, Pakistani, Cambodian, Hmong. So again, really trying to help demonstrate the diversity that exists within the Asian American Pacific Islander community. It's not a monolith, and we have to really understand each community individually to understand their experiences, their challenges, their struggles, and their identities in order to be really, to have that, develop that empathy to understand what's going on in this current context. Moving on to the next slide, this is another sort of imagery of seeing that diversity, right? The AAPI story needs to be diversified in order to capture the diversity and fullness of the experience of AAPI communities and individuals. Okay, moving on. So, racism against Asian Pacific Islander is not new. Unfortunately, anti-Asian discrimination is nothing new in the United States and has long historical roots. So we kind of peel back the layers and kind of look at this imagery that's in front of you. We look at the 19th and 20th century, Asian immigrants were subject to villainization and horrendous racial violence. The 1800s were the beginning of the troop of Asians are here to take our jobs. So in the case of People versus Hall in 1854, the California Supreme Court ruled that people of Asian descent could not testify against a white person in court. Chinese Massacre of 1871. 500 rioters attacked LA's small Chinese community, lynching 19 Chinese men and boys. No one was ever punished. Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 banned Chinese immigration until 1943, the first legislation restricting immigration targeting a specific race. Okay, until 1943. Let that sink in for a little bit. During the 1900s to 2000s, Asian Americans were targeted and blamed for their foreignness. So when we look at the Japanese internment during World War II, the US government forced 117,000 Japanese Americans into internment camps, seizing property and assets. They were essentially detention camps. They were detained. The murder of Vincent Chin in 1982. Chinese American Vincent Chin was beaten to death by 2 white men in Detroit, blamed for the Japanese taking their jobs. The men were given probation and a $3,000 fine. 9/11, the rise of Islamophobia. In one instance, Balbar Singh Sodhi, a ski American gas station owner, was murdered for wearing a turban, mistaken for a Muslim. So as you take a moment to kind of hear sort of some of this context of history, what has happened in our country, the roots of anti-Asian sentiments are pretty deep. And when we look at current day, I'll share a little bit more about sort of how that's also showing up in today's day and age. So moving on to the next slide. When we look at the Asian American as a community, and we think about it as a political movement. So the term Asian American was actually coined in 1968. The Asian American movement was made up of many movements and struggles, sharpening the protests against the war in Vietnam, offering social services to Asian communities, fighting evictions and displacements, analyzing the intersections of gender, race, and class. The 1960s was also a time of legislation change for Asian Americans, during which the government finally eased some of that restricting of immigration and opened its doors to new Asian immigrants. So another big pivotal historical moment, the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, which ended the quota limiting Asian immigration and provided the active recruitment of professionals and students from East Asia. And then also in the wake of the Vietnam War, the United States resettled more than 500,000 refugees from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, including my parents, and really diversifying a lot of the different Asian communities across the United States. In addition, inspired by the Black Power movement, students of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean heritage have previously thought of themselves as distinct communities, imagine a pan-ethnic collective defined from within. While first-generation Asian immigrants had fought for the right to naturalize and to own property, this generation was beginning to fight for their rights as Americans. If you go to slide 8, you'll see a few highlights of some prominent community organizers and activists. So if you don't know them already, I encourage you to learn more about their story. Yuri Kochiyama is a Japanese American political activist in the 60s and was a strong ally of the Malcolm X movement in promoting civic and human rights. She led the reparations movement for push for a formal apology from the government for the internment camps. Richard Aoki went to college in Oakland with the Black Panther founder, Bobby Seeley Huey Newton of the Black Panther Party. Bobby asked Richard to join the Black Panther Party because the struggle for freedom, justice, and equality transcends racial and ethnic barriers. Okay. Moving on, when you think about sort of the different ways that this shows up, and another thing that is important to understand is the model minority myth. Some of you may or may not have heard this term before, but is this something that is really detrimental when we think about the Asian American Pacific Islander community. So we think that AAPIs are often seen as the model minority for their socioeconomic and educational success compared to other racial groups. But this stereotype belies a complicated reality for what the most ethnically diverse minority group. Rooted in the pull yourself by the bootstrap ideology, the term model minority was popularized during the 1960s civil rights movement. This stereotype is racist to both Asian Americans and other communities of color. The model minority myth is a stereotype that generalizes Asian Americans by depicting them as a perfect example. If they can do it, so you can success story. So here on this slide, you'll see sort of kind of how this is broken down into more description of why this is important to understand. The model minority, oh, go back, sorry, Allie. The model minority myth minimizes and erases racism and violence against Asian Americans. Being a model minority has never saved Asian Americans from racism. So again, I encourage you all to learn more about how this affects your communities, students, and understand that this is a assumption and myth that is very detrimental. Moving on then, Allie, to the next slide. Here you can see sort of the wage gap, right? Again, we talked about the diversity of within the Asian Pacific Islander community. So you can see the wage gap within the community itself from Taiwanese, Indian, Malaysian, all the way to Burmese, Nepali. So again, lumping all Asians into one category is very problematic because there's such a diverse range of needs, struggles, and challenges. But then again, the model minority sees all Asians in one category group. So I think this is why it's really important for us to understand the diversity that exists within each community. Okay, moving on, Allie. So in terms of what's happening now, right, when we talked about anti-Asian racism, that this is something that is not new in the United States, but with COVID-19 and the pandemic, things have just continually grown tremendously. So when we think about these hate crimes and what's happening here on the slide, you'll see the statistics. You know, the most recent with the 8 innocent people who were killed in Atlanta spa shooting on March 16th, 6 of them were Asian American women. Over 3,800 anti-Asian hate incidents have been self-reported. And we know that that number is probably drastically underreported because a lot of these are not classified as anti-Asian hate crimes, or people are just afraid to come forward. 500 anti-Asian hate incidents have taken place alone in 2021. 66% more of these hate incidents were targeted against Asian American women. There has been a 150% increase in hate crimes against Asian Americans in 2020. So again, these statistics, we continue to hear them. This is sort of the data that's telling us what's happening in our AAPI communities. So ultimately, this pandemic has exposed the cracks in America's society, bringing forth the layers of systemic racism and legacies of injustice that many people have chosen not to pay attention to until now, right? When we think about what we've been seeing in the media, these images that you're seeing of people being brutally attacked, the elderly, the most vulnerable, it's only because folks are speaking out and that there are photos and video footage to be able to share what's going on. It's not only up to the Asian community, it's not only up to BIPOC communities to do the work of building solidarity. It requires the responsibility of everyone to understand how white supremacy has played in crafting these rifts against communities and exploiting them over and over again. Okay, next slide, Allie. So again, you know, I know that folks have seen a lot of these headlines in media, online. You know, a lot of these videos are hard to watch. As I was preparing for this conversation, just reliving that trauma over and over again, it was something that was really hard for me to do. And I caught myself just in that another emotional state. So, you know, when we think about taking care of ourselves too, making sure that we recognize how our body is responding, I think we need to be able to take a moment to step back, but encourage folks to just, again, understand what's happening on the ground and really do your research and understand our communities that are hurting right now. Moving on to the next slide. You know, the YMCA speak out. So, the YMCA has always been part of those critical conversations that are happening in community. We all can be part of the solution individually and collectively. We need to stand up and speak out for equity and justice. This is a pressing community need, and we think about community-based organizations like the YMCA, institutions like Springfield College. We have an urgency to be able to respond and be there for communities. When we think about dismantling these long entrenched systems, it's not easy work, but we can do this together. And if we're willing to come together and really invest in equitable practices, dismantling white supremacy, dismantling racism in our communities and in our institutions, we will continue to push that needle forward. Here you'll see some screenshots of YMCA speaking out from our CEO of YMCA of the USA, Kevin Washington, that put a statement out on what was going on in terms of the anti-Asian hate crimes. We had a lot of different YMCAs share their solidarity and sharing their support for communities, especially for API communities. Then the last piece that I want to really have folks reflect on is these kind of 4 areas. Learn. Are you doing your research to understand what's happening? Ask. Are you checking in with your API colleagues, students, family members, friends? Are you showing up for community? Showing up right now, I know it's a little bit difficult with us social distancing and the pandemic, but are you showing up virtually? Are you signing petitions? Are you using your voice and speaking out? That leads to speaking up. Are you bringing these issues up in meetings and classes and conversations with other people? So really think through kind of these 4 big buckets and figure out kind of where are you in this space and how are you using your privileges and your voices to amplify what's going on and be part of the solution. So I will end with, that question earlier of where are you from? What are you? And as you see this photo of friends, family, colleagues that I've collected over the years, I hope when I get that question, I get the question of who are you versus what are you and where are you from? I am a daughter, I am a YMCA leader, I'm an advocate, I'm an ally, I'm a disruptor, I'm a long life learner, and really centering the experience around the individual and what the experiences they bring to the table versus being lumped into one category or assuming that I'm not from the US because I'm Asian. So thank you, Ali. I'll leave my last slide. If folks are interested in connecting, please reach out to me. There's my Twitter and my email. Feel free to reach out. And again, thank you so much for showing up tonight and being part of this important conversation.
Thank you, Trang, for providing us with an overview on what has been occurring among our API communities and the longstanding history. If we can all give Trang a virtual round of applause, either using your reactions or if you are on camera. Trang, we really appreciate you being here tonight. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Ben Morales, and I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as the Assistant Director of Multicultural Affairs and Coordinator of YMCA Initiatives at Springfield College. I have the honor of introducing tonight's 5 panelists who will be sharing some of their own personal stories and experiences, addressing allyship, and discussing how the current pandemic has affected the API community. Joining us tonight is Chadnico Hugh, who is a Springfield College alum and current Senior Vice President for Strategy, Innovation, and Impact with the YMCA of San Francisco. Professor Hai Kinnell, who serves as the chair of the Biology and Chemistry Department at Springfield College. Deb Alm, who serves as the director of the International Center at Springfield College. Grace Moore, who is a current junior and student athlete at Springfield College, majoring in pre-physical therapy. And Kamalani Yen, current grad student at Springfield College, who also serves as the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Massachusetts Asian American Commission. Tonight's panel will be moderated by Springfield College Vice President of Inclusion and Community Engagement, Dr. Calvin Hill. Dr. Hill, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ben, and thank you so much to our panelists. So the way that this is going to proceed, I will ask a question, and then I'll give an opportunity for each of our panelists to address it. I would like to ask, as Ali shared at the beginning, that we'll hold all questions till the end, and we'll try to make sure that we can get to as many of your questions as we can. Saying that, we'll get started with our first question. Our first question is the following. This year, as a campus community, we use the phrase or the mantra, silence is not an option, to guide our anti-racism work. Can each of you speak to the idea that words matter? And how should we respond to racist rhetoric like the China flu? Grace, can you start us off and perhaps respond to that question?
Sure, yeah, I can speak on the idea that words matter. I think an open conversation with those in your circle, such as your friends, your family, peers, among others who you can make an impact on, is where people listen the most and is the best way to become aware. This is the reason why I decided to speak about my experiences regarding race and encouraged all those in my circle to come. I'm extremely grateful of those that showed support for me and furthered their support to come to this program and listen to the struggles and concerns that the community I identify with is going through. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for being here. To get back to the topic, words matter because people can become aware and educated on topics from a different perspective and understanding. Empathy comes from understanding. We cannot do better unless we know better. For reasons, the Asian Pacific Islander community has been struggling to find these words. Personally, I come from the cultural belief instilled in me by my mother that avoiding confrontation and conflict will create harmony. In other words, when you're faced with any such incidents, it's better to keep your head down, not talk about it, and not rock the boat. While for others in my community, they struggle to find these words because of their limitation of the English language. Would any of the other panelists have anything they'd like to add on to this?
Thank you so much, Grace. So looks like Deb on.
I'd like to remind us that we are in an educational institution and that educators have to speak up if they hear or they see or they read discriminatory remarks every time. We have to be there all the time, and it is our responsibility as educators to learn. We learned a lot from that presentation earlier, and I hope that we can share that with the wider community and be responsible for carrying that forward.
Thank you, Deb. Dr. Kennel, do you have any thoughts on the question?
Yes, definitely. As one of the slides said, that silence is being complicit to the aggressor, and that is definitely true. You know, being someone that is being picked on and nobody says anything, you think everybody agrees with the aggressor, and that is a terrible loneliness that people feel, that I have felt, right? So. And as Deb said, we are in an educational institution. You know, we teach and we must recognize things that are around us and speak up and give the victims a voice and make everyone aware of the situation so that change can be had. Otherwise, it will not happen.
Thank you so much. Chad, any thoughts on the question?
Absolutely, and I appreciate the chance to be with everyone. So I think words do matter. And we do have a responsibility in an educational institution like Springfield College and as citizens of the world to speak up. But also I would challenge us that we have a responsibility to speak up, not just about the acts of hate or the words that hurt, but the reasons why those words are deemed as acceptable by some, right? There is a context where if you're not a part of the majority, somehow we must acquiesce into that. So I think it's great, and I strongly recommend for those that are looking about how to be an ally in this context, specifically for API communities. Yes, if you hear someone say China virus, stop them. And perhaps when appropriate, challenge to think why that narrative was even lifted up. Why didn't we say the Italian virus, right? And why is it that we can lump everyone with similar physical features into one context framed by words to this question? And why is it that we don't with others? The last thing I would say too is words do matter, but actions also. I know this bleeds into a question coming down the line. It is now super popular for everyone to be woke and very unpopular for folks not to be. And even the definitions of that word. And I would say talk is cheap, right? I've been in multiple situations where people talk a good game, both within organizations and also in society, in friend groups, in family groups. Actions speak louder than words. And the last is speak up when it's not safe. I recently moved from Chicago to San Francisco with a stop in Hawaii to take a new position. The amount of time that I felt with the tension so thick that you could probably cut it with a knife, of being singled out, of having to watch my back in a way that perhaps is different than my colleagues or siblings of color from other racial and ethnic groups, it's intense. I would have loved when the United Airlines agent asked me and my husband to step out of line with a loud, demanding tone for someone else besides myself to advocate on my behalf. So in that context, words matter too.
Thank you so much, Chad. Kamalani, could you finish this question out for us?
Yes, thank you for having me tonight. When I saw this question, I immediately thought of solidarity. Solidarity is very important. Solidarity matters. I think staying silent makes as big of an impact as the action that is happening. So us as communities, we need to band together and fight for what is right, and fight and be kind of an ally and a co-conspirator in those situations where to make sure that people don't feel alone or that they're dealing with it.
Thank you so much, Kamalani. I'm going to move to Chad again. Chad, you kind of alluded to, a response to this in your response just a few minutes ago. But have you been on the receiving end of racism, microaggressions, or hate speech? And if so, how did those acts make you feel? And then I'll say that any of our panelists can respond as well after Chad.
So I would say yes. I won't recap what I already shared. And they made me feel inhuman. They made me feel small. I am born and raised in Honolulu, Hawaii. So I was not raised being a part of the minority. It wasn't until I went to Springfield College under the guidance of folks like Dr. Joe, who I know was on this call, where I understood that I was a minority, where someone told me that I was of color and that I even was Asian. It was told to me, not something that I could identify with. So it's not comfortable. And it happens all over the place. I still remember going to Jewel, it's a supermarket in Chicago, right when the pandemic hit. And I made the mistake of moving my cart in front of a lady and she coughed. Now, I obviously wasn't facing her, but how I received that was that it was because I was Asian and I dared to step in her way, right? And she said something under her breath, which I interpreted to be a slur of some kind, but I don't know for sure. It was so quick, right? It makes you feel like, I get emotional still talking about it. It just doesn't feel good. At the same time, I think we get put into this context, Dr. Hill, of having to play the oppression struggle Olympics, of somehow as API folks, as Trang alluded to, and others, that our struggle is not enough. And I don't think that's appropriate. We all have our own struggle. We all feel a certain way when those microaggressions and acts of racism step into our space. I know my colleagues have more to share.
Thank you so much, Chad. We're going to transition to Kamalani. Kamalani, can you speak to, perhaps any acts of microaggressions that you've experienced?
Yes, mine is a little different. So my identity, I identify as a Pacific Islander. I was born and raised in Hawaii, so that was kind of cool to see that you are from there. And it wasn't until I left Hawaii that I felt all of the pressure and I felt all of the microaggressions. I am not only Native Hawaiian, not only Chinese and Filipino and Puerto Rican. I'm a huge mix, and that's normal in Hawaii. But when I came over, it was different, and I was called a mutt by my what is the word? I guess by my classmates. There we go. They were calling me a mutt, and I don't think they meant it in a way that or they understood the impact that it had on being called a mutt. It's like you're trying to put me into a category, trying to put me in just Asian, trying to put me in just Indigenous, Native Hawaiian, or trying to put me in just Latinx. Like, no, I'm all of the above. I would not be here today if I was missing any one of those. So that was definitely hard, and the culture shock moving away and moving to Massachusetts was a lot.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kamalani. Grace, do you have anything that perhaps you can share with us in reference to experiencing racism or microaggressions?
I've had 4 impactful incidents occur that have heightened my awareness to being perceived as different. I feel like when you can count the exact number of experiences, that's when you know they've made that kind of an impact. 1 occurred in high school and 3 within this semester alone. The one that happened recently was around Chinese New Year's, where a Springfield College worker asked me why I was eating Subway for dinner at the Union instead of the Chinese food being served at the dining hall. I remember very distinctly his following remark, they do it just for you. Even though I experienced insensitivity in high school, this for some reason still caught me off guard. It caught me off guard because of how hard he divided the phrase into a they and you, as if I wasn't American and hadn't spent all my life growing up in American culture. I also come from a background of knowledge knowing there are more Asians than just Chinese. I mean, he was just lucky he guessed right in this instance, but it made me feel frustrated that there continues to be a lack of awareness and that people with an Asian face are still stereotyped under one culture.
Thank you so much, Grace. All right, Professor Keno, any thoughts to the question?
Oh yes, definitely. Yeah, I concur with Grace and Chad. It makes you feel very alone. It makes you feel ostracized when you hear and sense the microaggression and sometimes very blatant racist rhetoric pointed at you. I remember, coming here to the States with my mom, and we already felt alone. We already felt different, and that just made it so much worse. Like, you'll never get accepted here. So that it's very deep rooted. It's hard to explain unless you're at the receiving end of that. But yeah, it's hurtful. It's like, what gives you the right? I mean, you don't even know me. How can you say those things? It's just, yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry. Deb Alm, you work with many of our international students. Have you heard from them in terms of experiences that they've had either on campus or within the community? I think you're on mute, my friend.
Prior to the pandemic, I think that biases were probably not seen through the lens of race, but I think the pandemic changed all that because suddenly it was different. And I'll give an example. In Asia, in many Asian countries that I have visited as well, the wearing of masks is not unusual when people are sick. If there's pollution, it's not something that is an other, it's accepted. And when families were concerned about their children in the United States at this time of the pandemic, they would send masks, and that they were probably the first ones to be wearing masks regularly before it was even required of everybody in the States to wear masks. And so that automatically marks them. And I think that they may have felt uncomfortable with that because the families are saying, wear these masks, it's important. But the society around them is saying, what's wrong? Why are you wearing masks? And so I'm sure that I can't speak for all of them. There are lots of different experiences, but I suspect that they had a particularly difficult time. In the United States, there's 1 million international students, and 70% of them come from an Asian country, the many, many Asian countries that we have. And so that's a lot of students, a lot of young people in our institutions in America who had this experience. It's perhaps a different experience. They may not have the language to talk about racial biases, and I think that's part of our responsibility. I know in my office, we're already talking about what will our orientation look like to give students the language that they may need to be part of the conversation.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Devin, I think we're going to stick with you. And if you would start us off with this next question. And the question is, how should we integrate international students into a conversation on race that has been largely domestic?
That's a good question. I think that this year, the first year students had the advantage of the Springfield College seminar, which did a really good job of introducing students to that conversation and giving them the language, because I'm not sure that all our domestic students were equally at ease with the conversation. So they were all at a level playing field. Perhaps our graduate students struggled a little bit more with that. But I think as we build living learning communities, as we create safe spaces, make sure that they understand that there is an international student organization, an international center, places where they can go, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, places where they can go where they can feel free to talk about this.
Thank you so much. Any other panelists like to respond to that? Chad, perhaps?
I think I would affirm what Deb said, and I would add that there is racism and anti-Asian sentiment around the world, and there's anti-Blackness around the world, and there is a narrative fueled by colonialism around the world. And so I think, yes, and the more that we can contextualize, as Deb champions and all that she does, that we exist in a world. And in order for us as Springfield College students and alumni to be effective in the world, we must be able to translate not only on the Springfield College campus or through the Springfield College experience, but also when we leave it, how the issues that we're dealing with in the US are informed by and sometimes a product of what's happening in the world. Global village, as they say.
Thank you so much, Chad. Professor Kennel, any thoughts on, how do we integrate international students into this largely domestic conversation on race, specifically right now?
Yes, I think, unfortunately, racist chatter, racist acts are directed by just appearance, and international students in this country are going to be subjected to the same, racist acts that Asian Americans do. So they need to be brought into the conversation. They need to be aware of, that there is a minority that feel this way, that the majority is with you, or that there are things you can do. You have support, and I think that's important for the international students to know that they're not alone in this.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Kamalani, Grace, any thoughts on this question before we move to the next one? Nope. All right. Very good. All right. So our next question is a question that all of us can perhaps, speak to, and that's, do you believe the history of Asian American exclusion and discrimination should be taught in our educational system? If you all are like me, many of the slides and so forth that Trang Trong shared with us were eye-opening. And perhaps things that we weren't familiar with. So let's start with Kamalani. Can you speak to whether or not we should be teaching, Asian American history in our schools?
Yes. So another little thing about myself, I'm also a third grade teacher. And I am, from my own personal opinion, I think ethnic studies are very important, and we need to incorporate them into our K through 12 educational systems, because we need to teach our kids solidarity. That's how it happens, through education, through understanding, through compassion, and being also giving them the education to stand up for other people. Not only be proud of who they are, but also be proud of the people that they are friends with, or be proud of the people that are in their communities. So I think the history of Asian Americans, of Asians, of Pacific Islanders, of Indigenous, of Black, of Latinx, all of these BIPOC communities need to have their history. They need to see themselves in the K through 12. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Professor Kennel, what are your thoughts?
Well, being an educator myself, obviously, I'm all for knowledge. The more knowledge we know, the better, and that serves us to try to not repeat our wrongs. And I think definitely the history of Asian Americans should be taught alongside other cultures. We are a melting pot. We need to know how this country arrived to where it is, and what has happened in the past, and emphasize things that are good about the past and try to avoid the mistakes that we've made. I mean, I didn't know about the Japanese intern camps until I saw it on TV. It was like, I didn't know this happened, right? And that was very eye-opening. So definitely, history must be taught.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Deb.
Yes, of course, as Hai said, that we need to be educators in this area. I think we also need to make sure that a thorough understanding of how Asian immigrants have been portrayed in movies, TVs, and counter that with understanding the impact Asian immigrants have had on religion, on culture, on the food we eat, on the way we think, and what they've added to the diversity of our lives.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So we'll end with Chad or Grace. Any comments or thoughts in terms of this teaching of Asian American history in our schools?
Grace, go first.
Oh, sure. I was just gonna say I completely agree with all the panelists that have already spoken. They nailed it on the head. Chad, anything?
I agree with Grace. I was going to say it's all been said. I'll just underscore what everyone said with one addition, is to lift up the contributions and the exclusion, and to not teach it in the context of a deficit-based lens, and to note what needs to be required by all students. If I remember correctly, Asian American Lit, for example, was an elective. Dr. Joel, I forget, like maybe it's time for certain things to be required. Not then someone would say, well, then everything, we're gonna have too many required courses. Yeah, so in today's world, there's a certain point when that has to be. So I guess I had something to add. Sorry about that.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chad. So we've got a rather complicated question next, and I hope that you all can help us speak to this one. And earlier, I think we've heard the concept of model minority a few times, and heard that the API community has really kind of stood on the side. And now we want to try to dive a little bit deeper into that thought process. Is this a moment within the Asian American community to now stand with other BIPOC individuals rather than be perceived as the model minority, which has perhaps been a wedge to others within the BIPOC community? What are your thoughts there? Kamalani, my teacher.
This again is from my personal opinion. I think it is important. I think, like I've been speaking all night about solidarity, it is important for us to stand up because, like Chad said earlier, with the Oppression Olympics, it's not going to work. Like if we are just pitted against each other, if we are considerably trying to be like, oh no, I have it worse. No, I have it worse. No, we need to show up every time. We need to show up in every instance, and that is important for sure.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So you spoke to Chad. So Chad, any thoughts there?
So I think I would just, Kamalani said it really well. I would underscore though, and maybe I'm wrong, educators, please feel free to correct me. Black, Indigenous people of color includes us as API, right? If we trace our roots, it includes us. I think a part of the honest conversation we have to have is, in many API communities, there is anti-Blackness, okay? And so racism is intertwined across the board. Pro-whiteness and anti-anything elseness is pervasive across the board. And so when we talk about standing in solidarity, yes, I mean, before the wave of anti-Asian hate sort of accelerated, I used to say, you know, as an openly gay Asian male, it's my job to show up as an ally in support of Black and African-American communities. But that doesn't mean I don't also want to be in solidarity in my own lens. Those things are not mutually exclusive. I can champion the communities I identify with and be an ally in solidarity. I don't have to pick one. We all don't have to pick one. And I do think too, remember the society we live in my opinion, just Chad's opinion, not YMCA San Francisco, I do like my job, so let's be clear, the society has pit us against each other as communities of color. It's almost as if we're situated to punch at each other as opposed to punch at the system for why we're even having this question asked in a panel. So I do want to draw that distinction also.
Perfect. Thank you, Chad. Professor Kennel.
Yes, I completely agree. I think we have to stop this us versus them mentality. Racism affects everyone, and you have to eliminate the stereotypes. You know, the model minority stereotype is, I don't know, it's sort of a myth in a way. You know, I mean, if you look at all the subcultures of Asian Americans, it's everywhere, and you know, people are people. Everyone wants the best for their family. Everyone wants the best, their children to do better than them. Everyone wants education. it's, those are commonalities that we share, and those are things we should celebrate and gather around on, not pit stereotypes against each other and divide us.
Perfect. Thank you. Deb, Grace, would you like to finish us off with that question with a response?
Sure. Yeah, I completely agree with everything that's been said. In my opinion, I don't think pain is comparable, so we should use that to stand in solidarity with each other.
Thank you so much. I very much like that comment, Chad, the oppression Olympics, right? We should not be trying to pit one another against each other. Deb?
There was an excellent slide in Trang's PowerPoint, which highlighted some activists, Asian activists who have made stop hate really the message, the hashtag that we need to remember, that it's about stopping hate and working together. And we can hold up those people as models. I think we could all learn something by going back at some point to those slides and finding those people and learning more about them and making sure that we have those models in front of us.
Thank you so much, Deb. So as we think about the concept of stopping hate, our next question really is one that perhaps we can, get some of your thoughts on too as well. And that's, do you believe the AAPI community has been scapegoated as a result of COVID-19? So Deb, you kind of alluded to stopping hate. So can we start with you?
Yes, I think yes, it has in certain individuals, and that's why we have to insist on presenting the facts and not tolerating misinformation.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Grace, thoughts on that question about scapegoating?
Yeah, I believe that Asians have been scapegoated. I come from an adopted background, but luckily my mother's from China, raised, but not all adopted Chinese have that same ability to have their culture be, or their original culture being there. And yet they're still perceived the same way and are treated the same.
Thank you so much. Kamalani.
Yeah, I want to echo what Deb said, and also what Grace said. I think from my personal opinion, I think for sure there's some sort of like, oh, well, who can we blame? We're going to blame wherever it is. And there's already underlying issues between, our country and China, and like underlying things that we are not as a country, we're not as educated on as we should be of that different conflict, I guess. And so I think because of that, and like we've been saying before, all of this history that we don't know as a community, they're automatically putting the blame on the API community to make it, easier, I guess, for them to be like, oh, well, there's the blame, that's it.
Thank you. Thank you. Professor Kennel.
Oh, definitely. I think, as Kalamani said, there are underlying issues that, that boiled over with this pandemic. I mean, everybody's very frustrated. We need to find the blame somewhere. And unfortunately, the Asian American community have been scapegoated by this. And you can see that, as you said, by the increase in violence against the API community. And you see it on TV and in New York City. I mean, I think I saw a report that New York City, the increase in violence against the API community is drastically higher than even much higher than 150%. And and this all stems from ignorance. I mean, when I heard like people were boycotting Chinese food because they were afraid of catching the flu or the virus, so like, what? Does that make any sense in your head? I mean, really? But yes, definitely. And we have to do a better job of educating others, speaking up, and emphasize the facts.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Chad, can you finish this question off for us?
I think, as my colleagues all said, yes, and it's not the first time. Going back to Trang's presentation, API communities have been scapegoated many times and singled out. You can look back to World War II and the discrepancies in the number of people from German ancestry versus Japanese ancestry and what their different experiences were or were not. So I think sometimes in 2020, it's almost as if we woke up to a whole bunch of stuff that was just more present because of social media, because we're all stuck at home for the most part, but it's not new, right? And it's not the first time.
Thank you.
And I would say too, there's a fear. It was almost as if the whole fear of life and death was projected on to everyone that was Asian because they thought we were Chinese, to the professor's point, not even recognizing the huge ethnic diversity that exists there. So just, yeah.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you. So we're at our last question, and it really kind of revolves around, Professor Kendall, you spoke about educating ourselves. So this question is for everyone, and I hope everyone can respond to it, but it's what can our campus or organizations do to ensure that API community members know that they are valued and that we as institutions have their backs? So perhaps let's start off with Deb Baum.
Okay, thank you. I've really enjoyed this conversation with everybody and hearing from everyone, first of all. But I think that first and foremost is a public statement of support. We got a public statement from our college president, Dr. Cooper, shortly after the incident at the spa. I also sent a message out to our international students. So I think a public statement of support is important. I think we can propose living and learning communities to build that inclusiveness and friendships right on our campus. Spaces for open conversations, recognizing those microaggressions of being excluded or avoided, ridiculed for accents, becoming invisible, having, you know, international values put down, all of that. I think we can all work towards that.
Chad?
Sorry, of course you called me. I was trying to affirm Tiffany's comment in there. Tiffany, whoever you are, that was on point. And yes, if you haven't seen Tiffany's comment, please look at it in the chat. I would say I agree with Deb, and sometimes let me take the interpersonal way lens. Let me go back to being a freshman on the Springfield College campus back in a year that shall not be mentioned. I think a part of it is just being an ally in the context of being present. When someone shares with you how they're feeling or feels lost or feels like they don't understand why someone is reacting to them a certain way, it's listening and affirming and having their back. I'll lift up Dr. Joel and Charlene Overs again because I see both of their names. A number of times, both of them went and fought for me because I didn't understand why I was being singled out, or comments around my ancestry were made, or someone raising their voice or not passing me in a class, or all those things I perceived to be partially tied to how I presented. That's one huge way to ensure that API staff, API students feel valued and seen and heard. The other that everyone said is education, right? And own when we make a mistake. Don't just like let it go, like call it out, learn from it, and then also address systems. Don't just keep on putting band-aids on programs and symptoms, but address the systems that can be ensuring that everyone does feel like they belong for who they are, not that they have to fit into a thing. Sorry, long day.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chad. Grace, you know, what are your thoughts, and what can our campus or our institutions do to make sure that our API community members know that we have their backs?
Yeah, so examples of how those around me had my back when I felt lost and hopeless after experiencing a microaggression is when I experienced one at the gas station at the roundabout 2 minutes away from campus this semester. While I was pumping gas, a man walked out of the store and proceeded to walk towards me, speaking in some mocking Chinese gibberish. When I looked up, he became more aggressive and asked, "What you looking at?" while continuing to walk closer and closer to me. I became cautious that the situation could escalate, so I quickly put the pump back, capped my gas, and locked myself in my car. And the man stood by my vehicle until he eventually walked away. This one hurt a lot. It hurt in that I didn't want to come home and tell my parents of yet another incident that occurred to me and give them another reason to worry about me. Even more, I felt a sense of guilt that when I would tell my mother, she would start to worry even more about her own safety. I will tell you what my mother's exact advice for me was. She said, "Grace, why don't you wear your hoodies up and put on glasses so no one can tell you're Asian?" I know my mother comes from a background of experiencing much more in her generation, but I have hope that my generation will continue to strive to do better so that no one has to feel like they have to live this way or advise their child to live this way. And it is evident that my generation is willing to take action. The most notable ways I received support was when one of my professors in my program took the time to pull me aside after class to tell me the ways I could report the incident and even offered to begin a report for me. Another professor even went to the site of the incident to take action despite me telling her of the event weeks after it occurred. They took the time out of their days to listen to me and make me feel like my next steps forward didn't have to be alone. My friends did the same thing, listening to my concerns and validating my emotions, despite not all of them being able to understand the situation at the same level as me. They lifted my voice by inspiring me and encouraging me to speak up for myself and to remain cognizant of those that maybe aren't in the same position to do the same.
Thank you so much, Grace, and thank you for sharing. And I'm sorry that experience happened to you. Professor Kennel.
Yes, I think the first thing is awareness, and thank you, Calvin and Allie and Ben, for organizing this. I mean, this has been great to bring awareness of this situation to our campus and our community. So awareness is first, and then leadership around this. And I'm glad that Deb talked about President Cooper, but I was also impressed that President Biden spoke up against anti-API hate, and Congress passed a hate act. So that I'm not sure if I got that right or not. But I know there's something in Congress to recognize hate against API communities anyway. But yes, and we must hold those that are responsible for hatred responsible. You know, I think the latest story I heard of that aggression in New York City, they caught the guy who did that, and they're going to treat that as a hate crime, and that's great. And I think we should act up when we see hate crimes happening. You know, I'm still aghast when I think about a couple weeks ago when that Asian woman was attacked. She was knocked down in front of a hotel lobby, and there's like 3 people in the lobby, and they didn't help her. It's like, and they just closed the door. Like, do something. There's 3 of you. Just go help the woman. Yeah, it's just, yeah. So awareness, take action, support those in need. I think those are keys.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, Kamalani, if you could finish us off with this question, please.
Yes, I think action and education are very important. I wanted to leave you all with a little story from the school that I teach at. I teach at Springfield Prep Charter School. Any aspiring teachers, reach out. But my school gave me the opportunity to have this conversation with my 3rd graders, have a conversation about the Asian hate and the Asian violence. And for me personally, I was nervous and I was worried about what my kids would say or not say, or what education they had. But because we built education with them on ethnic studies and on all of these things, they actually responded like, they're like, "Miss Ewan, no, if like that is so crazy that people would think that you, like, because you're Chinese, you may have the virus, or that Chinese people may have the virus." She was like, they were like, "I can't believe they would say that. I can't believe that. I can't believe that people actually think that just because someone is Asian, that they would have the virus just because of who they are." And again, they're 3rd graders, they're 9. And they brought up and sparked such a great conversation of being an active ally, being being, educated on all of these things, understanding how people, how we can get rid of the hate by education and through education. And the fact that they were like, if anyone did that to one of my friends, I would stand up for them because that is not okay. Like, it was an amazing conversation with them. So action and education. Education is very important because even my 9-year-olds in my class can put it together and understand how to be an ally.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kamalani. And thank you so much to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your openness. Thank you for your vulnerability. And just thank you so much for just sharing your thoughts in reference to the API community. I am going to take just a minute or so to share a moderator's moment. I got a nice little chat from our president, Mary Beth Cooper, who wanted to interject for just a brief moment. So Dr. Cooper.
I thought you were going to say something the way you said that, like you were going to give us like maybe an interpretive dance, Dr. Hill, maybe you could, or a poem or something. I mean, you've done a beautiful job, Calvin. And I know many of the people that are on this Zoom have seen you all year long navigate lots of very difficult, but really important conversations. And so I want to make sure that I say publicly how much I appreciate you and your commitment to making sure that Springfield College is a better place for everybody and your leadership. And so I'm going to turn that right back to you in terms of our thanks to you, Calvin. You've been really a gem.
Dr. Cooper.
I want to thank our panelists tonight. It's been really informative for me. This is, and Chad, I was with you when you stumbled on your words a few minutes earlier. These days just seem long and longer. But I love the fact that you are a partner with us and that we can call on you and you can call on us. We are better for the people that are with us. And your 9-year-olds to our teacher above me in the Zoom are lucky to have you. You are creating the new leaders that we will someday be following in the world ahead. And so do good work because we need them to be at their best, right? And Deb Alm, you are a gem to us always. You have always navigated many, many different situations and helped us all, especially those of us that are on the Zoom that have traveled with you, to appreciate the importance of difference. Grace, your courage tonight is just amazing. I too am sorry that your experience was what it was. I hope that in the future, different experiences come your way. You deserve it. You are really a representative of Springfield College, and I hope that you are able to continue to lead with that courage, because that's what we need. And of course, to our faculty member in my top corner, Hi, who is just really a remarkable leader, a scholar, one that has added such value to this campus. I feel really blessed to have all of you be a part of our community, and I want to say thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cooper. All right, everyone. To our panelists again, thank you so much. All right. Earlier, I spoke about my wonderful friend, Allie. Allie, the floor is yours again.
Thank you to all the panelists and Calvin for helping us raise awareness, bring light to these stories, and really sharing your point of views on these timely topics. We hope that this is only the start of a dialogue that will initiate the change here on Springfield College. And we now welcome Carrie Okobo, who will enlighten us more on how we can take those transformational steps here at Springfield. Carrie is the social media director of Hate is a Virus, a leading nonprofit organization whose mission is to combat hate by mobilizing APIs and standing with other communities of color. The floor is yours, Carrie.
Hi, everybody. Wow, that was, I'm still like processing that panel. Thank you all for just sharing your experiences and your unique stories. It was really powerful. But yes, I'll just give a little intro. My name is Carrie Okubo. I am a 5th generation Japanese and Okinawan settler in the currently occupied Hawaii. So it's really cool seeing fellow locals on this chat. on this panel, but I am the social media director for Hate is a Virus, and also on the executive board of directors. And so we are a nonprofit community of mobilizers and amplifiers to dismantle racism and hate. Like a virus, hate spreads in both covert and overt ways, but also, unlike a virus, there is no one-shot cure to unearth the systemic racism and violence that have been happening not only to the Asian and Pacific Islander communities, but to all communities of color. And so I'll just talk a little bit about our history, because we initially didn't even weren't supposed to be a nonprofit organization. So Hate is a Virus first started by a simple hashtag social media campaign. So I'm also the social media director for a streetwear brand called Uprisers, and we are an Asian American women-owned brand. And so we, in the beginning and the rise of the pandemic, we saw, the xenophobic, the racist rhetoric that is being shared. We also saw that small businesses were really being affected and impacted prior to lockdown. So it really took a conversation with me and our founder, Michelle, really crying on a dinner table about what was happening, really processing, because, during that time, I was scared to go outside. I've never really felt threatened like that before. And just seeing it, and also just being on social media and seeing all these viral videos going on of elders, of women being attacked, it's shocking, and we just didn't know what to do. But we also saw a lot of hurt and confusion from our community, and knowing that we weren't alone in that feeling. And so Hate is a Virus started as just a social media campaign. We're saying to our community, to our just immediate community of friends, share with us your stories. Like, how are you feeling? How are you processing this? And really speaking out, because while we have had amazing activists, Asian activists, like leading the way for the liberation of our community, a lot of our community do stay silent. We do kind of play into that model minority myth of, kind of trading in that silence for success. And I will also state that something that wasn't mentioned before is how the model minority myth was actually created as a weapon to weaponize the Asian American community, to continue to enact violence against the Black community. It actually started with just kind of looking at the Japanese American community, who at that time was kind of rebuilding post-internment camps, and saying, kind of uplifting the Japanese community to kind of discredit the civil rights movement that was going on. And unfortunately, people couldn't tell the difference between Japanese people, Chinese people, Korean people. And so it kind of was an umbrella term towards East Asians, because the South Asian community, the West Asian and Central Asian community, and Pacific Island communities, while they all experience violence and racism in their own different ways, it's very different. So when we're talking about racism towards, especially the current acts of racism towards the Asian community, a lot of times we're talking about the East Asian community, which is a result of the xenophobic rhetoric that has been going on. And so since we are really able to talk about and have people really share their stories, really speak out, we also knew that there was a gap for education, and our community needed to be equipped with the education to speak out, because like I mentioned before, we don't learn about these things in the classrooms. We don't learn about these things even in college curriculum sometimes. I have people who have majors in ethnic studies, masters in ethnic studies, that still don't know the true history, and only really know like the sugar-coated, histories that we perpetuate. And so I think that really sharing our individual stories, knowing that the most personal is the most powerful, and really stepping into ourselves and our own identity. Also, the Asian American identity was only like 53 years old. It's a pretty recent term. And so as we're evolving as a community, we are still learning about how we can activate. But Hate is a Virus, we raise awareness. We provide educational materials such as Real Talk Tuesdays on our Instagram, as well as developing workshops around whether it's anti-Asian harassment in the workplace and partnering with other trusted local organizations, as well as amplifying the organizations that have been doing this work for so long, because we are a fairly young organization, only birthed in 2020, and there are a lot of nonprofit grassroots leaders and organizations on the ground who sometimes aren't able to activate in a digital space because they're too busy saving their communities and saving the lives of those around them. And so what we do is really use our platform with branding and using our community to really go into their own local communities, partnering them with their own local organizations to enact that change. And so some action steps that you can take is we are currently working on our campaign for our community action fund, where we are raising, our goal is to raise $1 million for API organizations. Prior to 2020, only 0.26% of all nonprofit fund or philanthropic funds go towards API organizations. And that gets even more skewed as we go and kind of disaggregate the data, because again, Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are not a monolith. And so that fund is currently going on, and you can go to our website to donate, and all of those funds will be dispersed as grants to other organizations that are based on the API community, centering around mental health, community safety, as well as solidarity building. And a couple of other action steps is to, really invest into your community, not only with money, but also with your time and with your talents. We talk a lot about your justice voice, and that's basically where your passions kind of intersect with the movements and where you're needed at that time, because we all have our different roles to play in this community. And because especially recently, we've been seeing a lot of music, dancing, we've seen bake sales, we've seen people really use their talents to contribute in the ways that they can. And so there's no one right way to activate in your community. And also to really be in community with people too. And that goes with volunteering with your local organizations, joining in spaces, whether it's in your local community, digital communities, and if a community doesn't exist around you, that means you just have to build it yourself. But really just listening to the voices of the most impacted, and also just doing the continuous internal work to dismantle these biases that are inearthed into us. And so I think that goes with just reading, that goes with talking. There's a lot of articles that we post on our website. There's a lot of articles that a Google search can take you to really learn about not only the histories, but also how each community has been impacted in a different way. And lastly, just knowing that solidarity is our only way forward. And I'd like to challenge the people here to really reimagine what it looks like for all people in this country to be treated equally. Unfortunately, we don't know what that looks like. We don't know, I personally don't know, a country where my identity isn't weaponized or marginalized. And so this really takes creativity. It takes us, it's going to take a huge amount of humility and a huge amount of empathy towards others to move forward. And knowing that we're going to make mistakes along the way, but it's important that we continue forward and we continue building power together. And so if you want more information about Hate is a Virus and the work that we do, you can go to our website at hateisavirus.org.
Thank you so much, Carrie, for giving us some action steps we can take here at Springfield College and really get involved with our community. I would now like to open the floor to our audience. Please feel free to put questions in the chat box, raise your hand, come off mute to ask any of our guest speakers. Please remember, just no political questions due to one of our requests of our panelists.
It's not a classroom, you can ask questions.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm an OT grad student here. I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who spoke today and Thank you for taking time to share your stories. I was part of a lot of the town hall chats that we did over the summer. And I hope that this is not the last event of this kind, specifically for the API community. I really hope Springfield continues to offer these types of just opportunities to learn about communities that just are different than ourselves. I think this was really, really important. I just want to say thank you, guys.
All right, I'll have a question, and that is, as a white person who strives to hopefully one day be called an ally, as I'm learning, would you share some examples or some ideas on how like white people have stood up for you in key times that really made a difference? Like, what are some of the most effective ways that someone like me could stand up and so that you would know that you feel supported?
I can kind of answer that. A simple, hey, that's messed up, goes such a long way, especially in your communities that you're in. I think that yeah, recently it was I do a lot of content on social media to kind of advocate. And it, you know, sometimes I'll get trolls and things like that, but a lot of times it does take, I have this community of like white allies that will just go in, and that because it is traumatic to continuously defend your existence. And so it is doing the work, but also in your immediate community is just calling it out where you see it, goes a long way. And I know that that's uncomfortable for a lot of people, but you know, I say that bravery is a muscle, and to continue to exercise it every single day, you know, and so continuing to just advocate, call it out, and say that's messed up, again, works wonders.
Thank you.
I'll make a comment. This is Laurel Davis Delano, professor of sociology. I think it would be interesting for the college to explore. We've talked a lot about the underrepresentation of Latinx and African American students. I think it would be interesting to explore through research the reasons why we have an underrepresentation of API students. And anyone who wants to comment on that can. Or not.
So this is Chad. If I heard correctly, because my lens on Springfield is 20 years old, as hard as that is to say, are you saying that there is still an underrepresentation of API students vis-a-vis African American, Black, and Latinx students?
No,
okay.
Not relative to other groups of BIPOC students, relative to the percent in the US and also in the Northeast, which is our recruiting area.
Got it. No, I think that would make sense. I'd be interested too.
Susan Joel has a question. She says, thinking about the model minority stereotype, can you speak to the ways that even a positive stereotype can be painful?
Yes, actually, I was reading that. I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question before because I was trying to reading a chat. But I do have an answer for Susan, and I think that stereotype gives you a very high bar, you know, to have to achieve, right? I mean, it's like, oh, why aren't you good at math? Like, because I'm not. That's a stereotype. That's not me. I'm an individual. I have my strengths, I have my weaknesses. It's not what everybody says. So in that sense, it is detrimental.
And I can chime in too. I think, you know, oftentimes, and I had these conversations with actually family members too around the stereotypes that, you know, Asians are successful. And this family member said this, and I said, that's very problematic what you just said. And he's like, why? That's a good stereotype. That's a good assumption. Why would you be upset? And I had to really take the time to have that conversation by saying that an entire community or lumping Asians being typically successful or resilient, you know, for some that may sound like a good assumption to have, right? But when you look at the disparities among different Asian Pacific Islander communities, they're shadowed under that particular assumption, right? So when we look at success rates in college or even in, you know, in the economic growth or whatever it is, like there are some groups that, yes, are typically more successful, but then you have other groups that are not. And I think that depicts a picture that is unfair and not accurate. So even though it may sound like a good stereotype, it's still an assumption that is really damaging. So I think that's why we have to really unpack that model minority and that myth and where that came from, right? Again, it was rooted to cause wedges between communities of color, especially between Black communities and Asian communities, as a divisive way to kind of like, well, if that group can do it, why can't y'all do it, kind of thing. So. No, that was sort of the informal way to explain that, but I would encourage folks to, you know, really do your research and kind of understand more about the context of that particular assumption and model minority.
And if I could, just to underscore the point Trang made, and I think Kari spoke to this as well, is the model minority myth, and Kari's word was weaponized, and that's a great word, right? Model minority meant that we were somehow not, someone called our community one time more palatable, or called me more palatable, right? Means we're not Black. Like there's anti-Blackness in everything that we're talking about. And that's a part of what Kari alluded to, why the model minority myth, though it's framed as positive, it's not, because it's all framed in this broader context of what the model is and how we maybe don't make as much noise over the model. And it's not just successful, even though that's true. I think it's also, we don't raise hell, typically, historically. So it's almost saying to be successful, but not white, you can't speak up.
Thank you, guys. Tiffany, you will probably be our last question for tonight.
I don't know if that's going to be helpful. Hi, everybody. My name is Tiffany Benford. I'm a new clinician at Springfield College and also in the role of as a diversity specialist. My question, you know, it's complicated. That's why I just said, I don't know if this is the best last question. You know, as a person who identifies as being multi-ethnic and also, you know, there's a lot of assumptions around BIPOC folks in mental health. And one of the things that we've seen come about with a lot of the televised trauma regarding anti-Blackness and, you know, the murders of innocent people, particularly from the Black and Brown communities, one of the things that I'm thinking about as a clinician is how is this racialized trauma? And, you know, we started off by just saying how we need to do self-care and how we need to be mindful of exactly how much exposure that we're seeing, but the exposure is also one of the reasons why these conversations are being had, right? And so as a clinician, I'm wondering, you know, how to continue to fuel and uplift the importance of mental health in a culture or multiple cultures that the stereotype is, you know, we don't talk about it, right? And so I'm wondering if anybody can speak to that and what can be highlighted as a strength to be brought into the mental health community as a person who does research and does everyday work around assisting specifically folks that do not identify as non-white. Told y'all it was complicated.
Yeah, I think I understand what you're saying. I mean, in the Vietnamese community, mental health is not something that we discuss. Is to keep that under your hat. You know, it's not really brought out into the open, and then because of that, people who need help don't get the help they need. So I think that is a detrimental stereotype that, you know, the Asian community keep to themselves. And yes, in some aspects that's true, but that's harmful in that particular sense. I think that was your question, yes, Tiffany?
Yeah, I feel like I said a statement and a question, so I apologize for being confusing because that wasn't the intention. I think sometimes I outwardly process, so sorry. More or less, like, I guess what I'm asking for the panelists, because you all can't speak for, every single community that's being, discussed here, right? So what I'm trying to understand is, in your own personal experience, are you seeing mental health being discussed more, like in a more relevant and forthright way? Because I feel like what I've seen as a person who, in my own culture, that I have seen a shift in that in the last few years that I haven't seen before, but that's my personal experience, right? So I'm just wondering if there's any other folks that are experiencing that as well, and what they're seeing with their peers and family.
Yeah, I can kind of answer to that a little bit. For my own personal experience, I think that for the stigma, for me at least, as people start to talk about it, as our communities are talking about it, as there are spaces for processing, there's more healing circles, there's more community building. I've found my own healing through that way. And also, we talk about a lot about how we take this trauma and really transform it, and alchemize it into power, and alchemize it into ways that we can activate in our community. Because if we hold on to all of this, we're gonna explode, and so for me, it was using social media. Like the work that I do is healing. We've seen, again, like music, we see art, we see poetry, we see comedy come out of these, and really seeing our community like transforming that, and just transforming this pain and trauma into ways that fuel movements and continue to build and uplift not only our community, but other communities. And so I think creating safe spaces, not only for that processing, but also if we're able to, and if you have the power to, and community to like help to guide those transformative practices.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all those wonderful questions. And this is just the start of a conversation that we hope to continue in the fall. If you would like to continue this conversation, there are some resources Molly's putting up right now in which you can learn more about our API community. Yes, and as well in the chat box, you can access those. So there will be a recording of this program on the Springfield College YouTube page. So please keep a lookout for a follow-up email with that link that you can share with friends and family. I just want to say thank you to all of our guest speakers for sharing their valuable insight and opening this line of conversation. And thank you to all the Stop Asian Hate committee who has helped make this program such a success. And thank you to everyone who was able to join us tonight. It is just the start and not the end. And Springfield College's support and allyship for the API community. So have a good night. Thank you.